Good evening, and thank you for logging on to Hidden History, URBAN-15's e-magazine on arts and culture here in San Antonio. And this evening, we are pursuing the theme of enduring distance. We're streaming this from our homes today. We are going to be spending some time with three prominent thinkers in our area. One was Chris Tomlinson. He's an author and a journalist with the Hearst newspapers. And he is primarily interested in the economic impact and what is happening around us. And he'll be presenting his thoughts on the long-term and short-term issues of commerce. City Councilwoman of San Antonio, Maria Antonietta Berriozábal. And she is always been known as a community activist, and her thoughts on how communities come together in times of crisis is very helpful for us to hear tonight. And finally, we have San Antonio author, futurist, thinker, who lives in LA now, Whitley Strieber. He has some global concepts and global visions about what is going on, and he's going to give us a little background of the impacts of the pandemics in previous periods of our history. And then we will close tonight with our very own Jonathan Anderson, who is the project manager for the Josiah Media Festival. And he's going to give us an update on how we're going to be able to see the best of Josiah over the next 4 weeks. So thank you for tuning in to Hidden Histories, and keep sending in suggestions. We appreciate it. Good morning, Chris. This is George Cisneros, Hidden Histories here at URBAN-15. And this morning, we're at home, both of us. We're both active people, and we're at home doing our business because of the lockdown. I would like to go into a conversation with you concerning the amount of money that it's taken to get us through this crisis and how we're going to recover that.
You know, it's remarkable how much money the government is pumping into the economy right now. Between, stimulus measures from Congress and the Federal Reserve, we're looking at almost $11 trillion of cash going into the economy, of money going to increased unemployment, money going to companies to keep people on their payroll. You're also looking at, some of the cheapest loans imaginable. You also, the Fed is also, injecting cash by buying corporate bonds as well as government bonds. It's an enormous amount of money. We've never seen anything quite like it. And, in a way, it makes good economics. We've known since the Great Depression that when you have an economic contraction, especially as one as dramatic as what we're experiencing, putting money into the economy is the only way to keep it going. This is not a time for austerity. The time for austerity should have been when the economy was going strong. And this is why we're in an especially bad situation, is that we were coming out of the Great Recession. We had record high employment. Wages were going up at every level. And, frankly, rich people were getting richer than they've ever been before. It was an enormous period of prosperity. And rather than do what the smart thing is, which, that's when you raise taxes, that's when you raise interest rates, that's when you save for a rainy day. Instead of doing that, we had a President Donald Trump, who was very anxious to make a mark on the economy. He wanted a big splash. And so he passed some of the most dramatic tax cuts in American history and drove the debt up tremendously. So we were already adding $1 trillion a year to the American debt during one of the periods of greatest prosperity in this country. And that's why it's so incredibly troublesome now that when we are in this dramatic economic contraction, we're piling even more debt on top of debt. You know, we're looking at adding $3.8 trillion to the federal debt this year, and that's completely unheard of. And we're not done yet. Congress may still put more, take on more debt and spend more money. This is going to come back to bite us. I mean, I know there's modern monetary theory, which says the government can borrow all it wants and it doesn't make any difference and we shouldn't worry about the debt. But that only goes on for so long. And eventually, we're going to run out of money. Eventually, the government is going to have borrowed so much money and have so much debt that there isn't going to be enough cash circulating in the economy for companies and for individuals to spend the money and do better. So, we're in this horrible situation, mostly because we took out too much debt when we should have been paying it down.
The middle class and going to have to carry much of this load into the future with their tax rates. And is there some relief that, or some kind of consciousness that we're passing this on to the people who can least afford?
This debt is going to have to get paid off eventually, and more than likely it's going to be on the backs of the middle class and the working class. I mean, that's who is taxable. They are the largest portion of American society, and they're also, frankly, the most politically weak, right? I mean, if you're very wealthy, you can make sure that you get your tax breaks, that you can lobby Congress. Most of your money is going to be in corporate bonds and corporate shares, which, those companies and those industries are going to protect themselves against taxation. So that leaves only the middle class to pick up the bill. And, we've already seen that from the Reagan tax cuts, right? The reason why tuition is so high, the reason why we have such a weak safety net is because of tax cuts in the past by the Reagan, from dating back to the Reagan administration. And so just as the middle class and the working class still suffers from those decisions, so will the working class and the middle class in the future.
I don't know if it was coincidence, but we have a oil industry that has been sort of mismanaged over the last few years. And simultaneously, we have this pandemic that is affecting the workforce of that industry. Can you give me an idea of where is Texas going to be?
So Texas is going to suffer more than most. Throughout Texas history, our economy has been based on extractive industries that rely on cheap labor, whether it was cotton, forestry, or oil. We have always had a plantation-style economy in this state. And it's one of the reasons why we don't take care of workers, and it's one of the reasons why we take care of corporations. Well, lately, the most important commodity has been oil and natural gas. And we have always relied on other countries, on Saudi Arabia, on OPEC, to keep prices high because we produce really expensive oil and gas. Well, those countries a few months ago decided to stop supporting us and let prices drop to a level that they know that we can't compete with. And so that's why we're seeing the bottom fall out of the oil and natural gas industry even before COVID-19. Now that we have the virus and we're all staying at home, demand for oil and natural gas has plummeted. And frankly, it's probably not going to come back anytime soon. So, Texas in particular is going to suffer more than most states. And frankly, because it's an industry that relies on physical labor, manual labor, it's going to be the working class and the middle class that suffer the most from the fallout.
This is a time when people should be stepping up in an ethical sense, and developing new ways of showing empathy to each other. Do you find that there's a corporate consciousness that some level of empathy?
So one of the things that we saw happening before COVID-19 was a recognition by some of America's biggest business leaders, people like Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan Chase, and the Business Roundtable, which is a coalition of some of the largest companies, largest employers in America. And even, as back in September, they were talking about having to rethink this 1980s idea of greed is good, that somehow shareholder value is more important than anything else. And they signed a fascinating document saying that from now on, they need to consider everyone when making their corporate decisions. They need to consider the employee, the customer, the community, and the shareholder. And I think this is a reflection of the changing values in the United States. When people are competing for labor, particularly youthful labor like the millennials, millennials really want to work for a company that does good while doing well. They prioritize quality leadership and community thinking. So we were on that track before. Not every corporation was buying on. There are still a lot of, CEOs out there who think that their only job in life is to drive up the share price so they can collect their bonuses and go home rich. And if they screw the community and the workers, that's okay. That's not their job to worry about. But those companies are not attracting workers. And I think in a period like now, during this pandemic, people are going to be looking, well, we know from polling that people are looking to business leaders to see whether or not they are being moral, whether or not they're being community minded, whether that is a kind of business that we should support as a community. I think also we see from the polling that the American people are deeply frustrated with their politicians. They're frustrated with partisanship. They're frustrated with bickering. And they're beginning to admire more and more the rather crass pragmatism that you see among a lot of business leaders. So every time you see a TV commercial of some corporation trying to paint itself as being community-minded, public-minded, worried about workers, worried about the people, they're not doing that solely because they think it's the right thing to do. They're doing it because we as customers and we as workers are demanding that kind of behavior. And we need to watch them closely and make sure that they actually follow through on these promises and on this newfound community mindedness.
On a daily basis, I normally get stopped by trains that were very long trains carrying automobile chassis and parts northward from Mexico to the assembly plants in Kentucky and Missouri and Michigan. And under the situation right now where there seems to be a stoppage of the supply chain, do you think that this is going to have long-term effects on the economy coming back?
We're going to have to rethink everything about trade and this economy and our supply chains. I think, our relationship with Mexico will actually grow stronger because of the pandemic. We have the new trade agreement, which I'm grateful to say is not that different from the old trade agreement. So I think we'll continue to see that trade across the border. It makes sense. And it's more important now than ever because what we've learned from the pandemic is that the super long supply chains going to China are not reliable. And so I think you're going to see every company in America looking for ways to source parts and materials closer to home within North America on these more secure supply chains, these shorter supply chains with friendlier countries, frankly. I think the larger issue is that as of this morning, we have 30 million unemployed Americans in just 6 weeks. And hiring those people back is going to be an incredibly difficult task. And I think we're also going to have to relook at how the government supports the economy. Right now, the Republican Party has had no problem pouring billions, even trillions of dollars into corporations and companies and small businesses, but they're much more reluctant to send money to individuals. They call this socialism. When they give money to people, they call it, smart capitalism when they give money to companies. It's a silly differentiation. If you don't take ownership if the government doesn't take ownership of the company, it's not really socialism. So socialism is kind of this horrible, label that doesn't make much sense. This designed to rile up the GOP base. But, we're going to have to rethink that with 30 million people unemployed. I think when the Democrats say that when you give cash to individuals, you empower them to start new businesses, you empower them to spend money, which goes into the economy. The Republicans argue that, that when they give money to a company, it's used for research and development and investment to build and to employ people. It's a philosophical difference. And it's also a values difference, right? The GOP plan supports the wealthy, it supports people with capital, and it hurts the working class. We support the Democrats support a grassroots, give the money to the people, let them decide what to do with it, and they're going to spend that money at the companies that make the most sense and better serve the community. With 30 million unemployed, we're going to have to give more money to the working class and to the unemployed. And failing to do so will just extend this crisis.
In an ideal situation, and the way your philosophy of business and government and energy fit together, can you give me an idealized view of what you think we should be doing?
So the path forward is not going to be, it's going to be compromise. It's not going to be partisan. There's not the Democrat or the Republicans. They've got their plans, but what we're going to need is a compromise between the two, because leadership right now is about bringing people together, not dividing them. So that's what I find so disappointing when President Trump or Governor Abbott engage in partisan politics at this time, because that just divides us. And I guess that makes sense ahead of an election. But, theoretically, if, after the election, we realize there's got to be compromise, we've got to bring things together. The smart thing to do is, frankly, move back towards a New Deal, right? The New Deal politics under Roosevelt. The private sector is not going to be able to hire all 30 million people, 30 million unemployed people back super quick. That's going to take time. And in the meantime, we need to make sure those people can pay their rent, buy food, support themselves. And we can do that by subsidizing work for them, by subsidizing them in their new companies. It's something we haven't seen in 70 years. Most people don't even remember the huge role that government used to play in our lives. And I don't, I agree with Republicans who say we can't stay there for very long. That's got to be a temporary solution. And as much as the COVID-19 pandemic is a crisis, the bigger crisis is climate change. And in order to prevent the worst possible outcome due to climate change, we have to get away from fossil fuels. And that's where the Green New Deal suddenly makes a lot of sense, because if we can employ people to improve energy efficiency, we can do enormous things with energy efficiency. We can employ people to install more solar, more wind. We can kill two birds with one stone. We can support our society, we can support the unemployed, and we can deal with a long-term solution. Part of dealing with climate change is, frankly, denser cities. It's going to be more public transportation. It's going to be repairing the infrastructure that we've allowed to deteriorate over the last 25, 30 years. And we really can't talk about debt and how much this is going to cost because, that's not what we should be doing right now. So there needs to be a compromise. I think GOP recognize that, this is not just another recession. This has the potential to becoming another depression. If we don't put people to work, if we don't spend money in the economy. But the Democrats are going to have to realize that these are temporary solutions, that we have to have the long-term view of government cannot fill the gap forever. It's got to be a stopgap, and that the long-term solution is to get government out of people's lives in the long run as much as possible once we've dealt with this crisis as well as the climate change crisis.
Chris, I want to thank you very much for your words. In closing, is there any last-minute advice you can give?
So, I think businesses need to recognize that everything has changed and they're not going to be able to go back to the way things were before. If you're a restaurant selling groceries in the lobby, you're likely going to be selling groceries in the lobby for a long time. If you're a tourism-based business or your livelihood depends on tourists, you're going to have to find something else. We're not going to have tourism back to past levels, perhaps for years. And we need to be, a little more, we have to be as self-sufficient as we possibly can. And that means we're going to have to be tighten our belts a little bit, be a little smarter about how we spend our money. But the big message is this is a larger crisis. This is a much larger economic crisis than it is a health crisis. And we need to keep that in mind going forward. And as depressing as that may sound, I feel like it's wrong to lead people to believe that we're going to bounce back immediately and that somehow things are going to go back to the way they were before. We need to be clever. We need to be creative. And, this might be the chance, the opportunity to go out and fulfill that dream that you've always had.
We are here today with Maria Antonietta Berriozábal, who is an esteemed community activist and organizer and elder, former councilwoman, elder stateswoman, and we really wanted to talk to you and kind of hear your own take on the current moment that we're in, and just kind of get some guidance for these times that we're in. So I wanted just to open with the question of how are you? How have you been dealing with the pandemic and with the distancing?
Well, first of all, I am so happy to be with you talking about something that I know most of us have been reflecting on and thinking. Certainly we have had enough time to do it. And ironically, I started in a period of being a caregiver back in November when my husband was hospitalized. So when this all came to us, I was already in a mode of being involved in our medical system, with doctors and nurses and caregivers, therapists. And when this hit, I was so aware of what was not only happening to so many people getting sick, being scared, but also the pressure on the industry and on the workers, and how I guess my biggest lesson has been that there is a network. There is a network of caregivers, of people, whether they're the people cleaning a room, giving therapy, the doctors and nurses. They work in nursing homes, they work in hospitals, they work in homes, individual homes. It's just a network. And I guess I've been frustrated because I don't think the systems, whether it's the political system, even the health system, acts on a network. So I guess if I can choose one thing that I've been consumed with, it's not only the risk that we all have of becoming, of getting sick, but also the system that is not ready to take care of all the people that need help. In talking to people around my age, we talk about the polio epidemic back when we were little. I remember my mother was so scared to let us go out the house. We couldn't go out. We went to school and church, and that was it. We couldn't go play at anybody's house, or because I guess what I remember of that period is my mother's fear because we might get sick. And when the polio vaccine came out, we were already, older kids, But that, and I also remember from the history of my family, that they went through the tuberculosis. I guess it was an epidemic. I don't know what they called it at the time, but I know they were living out in Lockhart in the country. And my grandfather and two of my uncles died of tuberculosis. Two others contracted it, but by that time they knew that they could be sent to sanatoriums. But there was such ignorance, and they were so poor and so out of anywhere where they could go to doctors, and they died. So those are two experiences I have, that because of my family as a child, but I can truly say that in my whole life, I never would have expected what I am seeing today.
Mm-hmm. So what are your observations on how the community has responded to this crisis? I know, especially among Chicano communities, Mexican American communities in San Antonio, there's this long tradition of what they call mutual aid. Are you seeing that? Are you seeing other things? What are you seeing?
Well, I think it's important for me to share with you that I'm in a very different place that I usually am in this community. I've grown up, and particularly in my youth and adult years, very connected to the community. I mean, out there, actually, in the churches, in the grocery stores, in the pharmacies, in the meetings, and spaces where community gathers. And I always like to say that I really can sense the pulse of my comunidad. And right now, I'm inside. I've been self-isolated, self-quarantined, I think we call it, for 6 weeks, and nobody has come in the house. So I guess the first thing I have to say is that I am profoundly, profoundly grateful to all the people who have been helping us. We have what we need. We have everything we need. And when I think about that, I think of the other people. For some, it's business as usual. People lack food all the time. People live from paycheck to paycheck, wondering if they're going to have that paycheck to get food and buy necessities. The issue of housing, of shelter, that's a very delicate issue in our city, a very serious issue. There are a lot of people who don't have what they need. There are a lot of homeless people. So we have to agree that for some people, it's like, hey, what's new? That's one. But then there are others also who have jobs. They work in the one I'm so conscious of is the informal sector, I guess you could call it. People who clean houses, people who take care of children, people who do yard work, although some of that has continued. People who work in restaurantes, for $2 an hour and tips. Those restaurants are closed. But but at least they were getting a little bit. And then the people who work and have jobs, that their business is closed. So what's left is a lot of people needing a lot of things because of the pandemic, but that's on top of the inequities we already have in the city. And, some of us, have worked on those things for decades. How can we change the situation of being a poor city? On the other side of the coin, to your point, people are generous, people are incredibly strong and resourceful, and people help each other. And I have seen people helping each other. If somebody doesn't know how to do a particular problem or something, maybe the neighbor knows how to help the child. Somebody doesn't have a computer, well, you can use our computer. Somebody needs some materials for school, somebody will donate them. People need food, they share it. People share, la gente comparte lo que tiene. And in our city, we've always been a kind city. That we are a generous city is evident also in this time.
Your analysis is always focused on the system, right? The problems in the that are more structural or system level. What's your take on how governments, whether local, federal, whatever level, have responded to those systemic kind of issues with this crisis?
Well, government does it with the tools they have. And the people that are working there and have been working there, bureaucracies have a way of responding. And our bureaucracy is doing what they do. And I think they're doing a good job. I am very appreciative of the mayor and the county judge having the lockdown when they did. Could have been done a little earlier, but yet I think a lot of people didn't get sick. And now we're waiting to see what they're going to do now. But just the way the pandemic came on top of a city that is a poor city, and it's just adding to that, we are also a city that has functioned a particular way, at least since I've been witnessing and participating in our history, which is from the 1950s. That's a long time. And I don't think we have ever had a debate on what we want for our city. What kind of a city is San Antonio and what do we want? And that thinking and I guess organizing occurred back in the 50s when a group of men, white men, decided that they needed to clean up the government that we had. That was a commission form of government, and there was a lot of nepotism and a lot of problems that needed to change. So they changed it and they wrote the charter. And as Dr. Rudy Rosales has so eloquently written in his book, The Illusion of Inclusion, he shares how decisions were made at that time, really leaving the people out totally. It was just a group of people making a decision, and they decided that the goal for San Antonio would be growth and expansion. We were going to grow. Well, once you establish that the goal of your city is to grow and expand, then you're going to need certain things. You're going to need construction. You're going to need new highways. You're going to need brick and mortar. And I don't think we have ever stopped to have the debate on what about the human element? What happens, like a major debate on public education, on health, as it has been shown now, on housing, on how we grow. And so what we did for so long, and we're still doing it, is just keep growing. We're all the way down to Bernie now. We're going to San Marcos, and we just keep expanding and not paying attention to what is it that we have. And to me, I've always said that what we have is the people, and that we need to concentrate. If we have this many people, let's say people who are poor right now, I mean, they're a treasure. They're children. Let's have the best education we can have. I was even dreaming the other day. I said, what does imagination mean, Maria? Well, imagination means, what if we could take all the public spaces we have and dedicate some of it to gardens, and have children come and plant, or golf courses, take a little piece of a golf course everywhere in the city and make a playground out of it. I mean, just turn the world upside down. And maybe this scary period we're going through will have us, number one, see where we have gone wrong, and to have people who are decision makers understand that we can't keep going like this. This pandemic came on a place that was already hurting. And that doesn't even include like people like undocumented communities, people that are in the jail, the people who are in homeless shelters. I mean, that's just like another whole group of people. I think there's always a time to start. And I think we do it by analyzing, how have we done it up to now? And again, using my imagination, I have time to have it go wild and crazy. I was thinking of Africa and Mandela, when we all of us got involved in the whole process of doing away with apartheid. And what is the first thing they did? They had a reconciliation commission, and they all got together and they talked about the past. And they were very honest in saying, these are the mistakes we have made, and we need to do better. But the first thing has to be an acknowledgement that not all is well. We can't just keep saying, we're a beautiful city, come here and have a good time. No, what about the workers at the theme parks who not only got furloughed, but they got their medical insurance taken away from them? And these are the companies that we gave tax abatements to back in the 80s. What are they doing now? Just look back at where we have been and to see where we need to go now. There's the whole thrust right now of, some people acknowledge that it's not good just to keep growing and growing and growing. So they said, okay, we're going to have the decade of downtown, and now we're going to invest in the inner city. And then more people will live in the inner city and we won't have to expand so much. I think there was a 25% of the housing that was needed would be inside Loop 410. But then when I look at the poverty map of the city, and you see a big red splash right in the middle, and then you see the areas that were targeted for investment and where the money was targeted for, it's in the places where the poor people live. It's like, did anybody see that and say, if we're going to plan to grow on top of people that are already there, what are we going to do for the ones that are already there right now? And the last map, I'm a map person, and the last map that I saw just yesterday was the zip codes where this pandemic has hit the hardest. And it's the same. If you will look at them, 78207 is one of them, and then you go back to the south, two more big areas. So like, how many maps do we have to see, and how many studies do we have to have?
Mm-hmm. A while back, you had mentioned to me that you had been asking yourself a question, and I think it was something like, if I had known that I would be dealing with something like this in my 78th year of life, what would I have done differently in my life? How would I have lived differently? And I want to ask you that question, but maybe in a kind of different way, which is more focused on us as a community, which is maybe something like, when this is over, when we get through this, what do you hope San Antonio will have learned? What would you hope it would have done, it will do differently in the future?
The first word that comes to me, Marisol, is compassion. We have to be at a place of compassion. First, I get real excited when I talk about analyzing ourselves and what have we done wrong and so on. And in my heart, it starts with like, can we be, and it's scary because it sounds like so Pollyanna, but do we have it in us to be a more loving community? You know, do we have it in us to be more compassionate? Do we have it in us to be kinder, but really kind, not just pretending kind? Can we really try and understand kind of like the other? You know, how do other people live? I was thinking right now of people, we went into lockdown and all the children had to start studying at home. And when that happened, I said to myself, what is going to happen with people that I know that hardly have room in their kitchens to eat, or the kitchen and the bedroom, everything's like one. And yet there are people, and many of them are the people who make decisions for us, that have beautiful big houses, you know, one room for this child, one room for that one. And after, we're going to have a break and they're going to go to the swimming pool and we're going to have a barbecue, and it's all inside this gated community. And it's not like really knowing what if I'm a public person, whether in business or whether in government, if I'm a leader of any kind, can I kind of peek and see, hey, what's happening over there? Just understanding each other, just starting with those intangible things of the heart, those intangible things of the heart that are not weak things. In fact, they are the most difficult things, you know, to start including our heart as we use our brain. You know, it has to be both. Anyway, those are some thoughts that I have.
What has your own particular situation during the pandemic revealed about the cracks in the system where people are falling through, especially caregivers, whether they're paid caregivers or unpaid caregivers, whether they're, you know, parents taking care of children or children taking care of parents or elders taking care of each other?
Well, first, Marisol, that as much as I try not to, because, you know, fear is not productive, but to be real honest, people at a certain age are scared. For many people who are vulnerable, or I talk to children who are taking care of their elderly parents, and if all of us can just imagine our parents when we had to take care of them when they were very sick. For some people, COVID-19 is almost the same as death. There's no way some people are going to heal. That's just the way it is, and any medical expert will tell you. And when we're doing the projections on, okay, if we go back to opening up our city this day, you know, how many people will die? And if we do it this, how many people will die? We're actually talking about collateral damage, you know. And I guess what I've seen is just the way people who are elderly and vulnerable are very much at risk, so are the vulnerable populations. So are the construction workers that I see out there with no masks. So are the people that are making the tortillas in the kitchen so we can go up and buy them. So are the people that are still cleaning at night so that when the workers come in during the day. Though not enough attention is paid to that, and I think we need to. For myself, you know, my husband and I talk about what a wonderful time we came to this earth to be young, and as hard as it was, you know, I lived in a good time for our country, and now look at what young people have to deal with. And they're so young, and some babies are being born today. What are we going to do to them? This really should change our whole way of thinking, Use our imagination, use our heart, and use our brain, and use data, and listen to health experts. And maybe we will learn something. If we don't, what a shame. And history will be written. And I hope each of us is doing everything right now that we can to have history be kind be kind to us and not say, look at what my great-grandmother or grandmother didn't do when this happened.
A contemplative life is something that is being kind of thrust upon most of us right now, not only in this country but throughout the world, because after all, in India there are hundreds of millions of people confined to their own homes at the present time, across Europe, across parts of South America. So we are all monks, and we are all cloistered just now. One of the things I've been doing is meditation, because it's so strengthening, and I do it on YouTube on Thursday nights at 7 Pacific time, and I do it for my unknowncountry.com subscribers on Saturdays at 11 a.m. So I've been doing a lot of it, and I do it, of course, also with my in my own life at 11 at night and 3 in the morning, as I have been doing for 50 years. And I think it's profoundly strengthening. I think I know, I mean, from studies, that it is very healthy, and so that's one of the kind of inner things that I've been doing. But looking now at the history of plagues and pandemics, we are really very much better off now in coping with this than we ever have been in the history of the species. If you look back to ancient Roman times, they, in the second century and into the 3rd century, they built an enormous system of roads around the Mediterranean, meaning that people began to travel for the first time, and they started spreading their local diseases among each other. And they had a series of catastrophic plagues that depopulated the Roman Empire. Then again, the Black Death, of course, and then the Great Plague of London. And there's a wonderful novel about it written by Daniel Defoe called The Journal of the Plague Years. It's the first sort of nonfiction novel ever written, and it purports to be a journal written during the time of the plague, but actually it was written afterwards as a work of fiction. And then we have the 1918 flu, which went completely out of control around the world because we didn't know what to do with these things. You know, what it was is we did not know really, we did by 1918, but prior to that, we did not know what we were physically. We had all kinds of ideas, and most of them completely wrong. And so people just died in great masses. Half the population of Europe died in the Black Death, and no one knows how many people elsewhere in the world, but probably at least a third of the population of the planet. That's not going to happen this time. And it's because of the fact that while even as we are sequestered, what are you and I doing? We're talking to each other as if we were in the same room. So we're not actually sequestered, are we? We are in a situation where it's obvious that a more contemplative life is at hand, but at the same time, we can communicate volubly with people all over the world. We could easily be doing this with you in China and me in Peru, very easily. Instead, you're in San Antonio and I'm in Santa Monica. But these barriers, these gulfs between people have disappeared. There's one thing, though, that we haven't thought very much about. What if this breaks down? Because it is, after all, machinery, the internet. And this would be a real catastrophe if it happened right now. And I've thought a lot about what to do about that if it does happen. And you would have to go into yourself. You would have to hope that you have some kind of means of communication, because in the old days, a lack of communication was the primary problem. If we return to that, it would be very dangerous. So this is my thinking presently about that subject. Well, we're certainly seeing a lot of that. Just a few days ago, as we're talking now, the Hungarian democracy ceased, in that the president was given sweeping powers to rule by a decree with no time limit by the parliament. In other words, the parliament in effect dissolved itself in favor of his rule. And the pandemic was the excuse. And that is happening in more and more countries. The United States is in a situation where it's less of a democracy than it was, say, 10 years ago or 5 years ago even. There are other countries, Brazil is a good example. China even is now essentially one-man rule. And, you know, if you look across history, you find very quickly that one-man rule doesn't work very well, because one man is simply not sufficient to make the kinds of decisions, the complex decisions that need to be made. They need to be made in groups. We are a species, a social species. And when we decide, well, it would be easier not to be a social species and just to rely on one man, we get into trouble. And this is why the system of kingdoms in the feudal system was so flawed for so long, and then eventually so interbred that, gosh, some of the Habsburgs toward the end of their domination of Europe look like freaks, because they're very odd-looking people. And indeed, if you go back to ancient Egypt, the inbreeding of Egyptian royalty caused that society to suffer a crisis of decision-making capability at the top. The same thing happens look at Adolf Hitler, who had absolute authority and was a complete idiot in terms of his military. Fortunately for the rest of the world, he was a complete idiot when it came to military strategy. And we will have a decline in the quality of government, and with it, a decline in the quality of life as the democracies contract. We have one opportunity probably to stem the tide in the United States. And if we don't, then this democracy will fail also, will falter also. That would be the election in the fall. But who knows what will happen between now and then? My goodness, so much has happened. I don't talk in terms of being a Democrat or a Republican, but I do think that we need a government that is respectful of the systemic structures that do not require compulsory obedience. In other words, when somebody is subpoenaed by Congress, they should go, not stay away. And that level of participation in the republic is essential to its survival. And that's not happening right now. And we have it in a situation where too many decisions are concentrated at the top level in the executive branch. This is something that's been going on. This gradual erosion of the power of Congress has been going on for 25 years or 30 years. And it's reached a crisis point now. And we have to turn it around or lose the American democracy. It's really pretty simple. If you look back into the time of the Black Death, you find a tremendous disruption in artistic output of all kinds of that in that era, followed by an explosion of artistic output that is intimately connected with a reduction in the obligations of serfs. And in other words, there was more freedom in the world after that, simply because the average working man was so scarce that he found himself having some power over the liege lord. The lord had to have him to work, and there were so few that they gained all kinds of concessions. This was actually the beginning, especially in the UK and England, of the journey toward a parliamentary democracy, which is a long journey from there, but you can trace it historically from the first shaking loose of the serfs at that time. In a place like Russia, that never happened, with the result that when the country, and it didn't happen in France either, when the monarchical system broke down and failed to provide the public with the basics of needs of life, there were violent revolutions. That didn't happen in England. There was a religious revolution, but it was brief, and it was many, many years later. Now, what's happening right now among writers and artists, I know very well. Everybody's working like crazy. I know I am. I'm working on a fiction and a nonfiction book and a TV series, and I'm very busy. In other words, very busy. And of course, I'm working in social contact over my website, but I do that always anyway. But more so now, simply because more people want to come into contact with each other, and they use the website as a means of doing so. So I think that after this, once this is over, a number of things are going to happen. First, unless there is too much destruction in the financial markets, the economy is going to bounce back with shocking intensity once we escape from the situation we're in now. And that when I say that in particular, I'm referring to the debt economy. A few months ago, the Fair Isaac Corporation made what will now in retrospect be viewed as a critical mistake. It downgraded the credit scores of millions of Americans based not on their consistency of repaying their loans, but on the amount of their credit that they were using. And the result was that even before this happened, millions of people were finding that they could not buy cars, they could not get loans, they were being pushed out of the housing market or made to get mortgages at very high rates. And when you add to that the corporate debt crisis, and possibly also a degradation of the currency because of all the money that's being printed now, you could end up in a situation something like the Great Depression. If this doesn't last that long, we'll survive that. Not all of the world will, but we will, and the Canadians will, and I would think that the Western European countries will. I'm not so sure about Eastern Europe, but they'll all recover. China will recover once its ability to trade goes on, because there's loads of pent-up demand now. I wouldn't want to be a manufacturer of things like toilet paper and disinfectants, because people have now got stocks of those that'll last for years, and the result is that the manufacturers had better be very careful in gauging how to meet future demand, because it's going to be very low. They should realize that. On the other hand, things like automobiles and movies and restaurants and clothing stores are going to do a tremendous business when this is finished, unless the debt economy defeats us first. We're in a race. Who will win? Will we win, or will the structural faults overwhelm us? We shall see. Well, I think that one of the things that is important is outreach. Arts communities and so forth who are dependent upon foundational funding and so forth should reach out to the public and take their offerings to the public in whatever way they can, and then go back to the foundations and say, we are helping keep the culture glued together. We are more important than you think. More important than you think. It's an emergency now, and you can't keep a culture glued together with somebody who has no food. That's very true. But as the structure establishes itself, and people, the means of obtaining the basics becomes more organized, then it's time for the arts community to say, we are part of this, and we have something to offer that you can't get anywhere else. And that has to do with maintaining the spirit and the sense of wonder that is central to being human and central to any healthy society.
We're talking right now with our Josiah Media Festival project manager, Jonathan Anderson, and he has been the primary driving force to make this all happen since 2012. Jonathan has worked putting a worldwide festival together, and we'd like to take a little time to get his thoughts and ideas about what the Best of Josiah will look like during the month of May.
So the Best of Josiah will be the 12 winning films from previous film festivals. We're going to be running the 2016, 2017, 2018 and 2019 winners, and it'll be 12 films each screening, 3 films from each of our film categories, which are animation, experimental, documentary, and narrative. So it'll be a big mix of different kinds of films, and we'll be showing each of the 4 years throughout the month of May.
Is this going to be available to the general public, or how does one get access to it?
It'll be available to anyone with an internet connection and a device that can access it. It'll be streamed live through URBAN-15.org, and you can watch it on your phone, your tablet, your computer, whatever you want. And each screening will be presented at noon and at 8 p.m. Central Standard Time. So anybody around the world should be able to find at least one screening that they can watch.
We have seen a growth in an interest in the festival from when it was just a local festival and people were submitting on tape and on DVDs. And now we have an international festival. How do people all over the world get in touch with you?
So when I took over, I noticed that we had mainly, almost exclusively, local entries that we were getting for the festival. And we wanted to maintain that, but we also wanted to broaden the scope of, who was entering the festival and what kind of films we could be screening here in San Antonio once we picked the winners. So we started doing an online submission platform, which is free of charge. And once we opened that up, we jumped from, 200 entries a year locally to over 2,000 each year. And we get them from all over the world, from India, China, Europe, Russia, Australia, a lot of them from South America. And it's really become an international festival.
I've noticed through time that many of these young filmmakers, the criteria is they have to be under 21. They don't quite have the filters yet of needing a sponsor or being underwritten by a studio. So some of their messages are actually closer to today's reality than a film that takes 5 or 6 years to come from script to theatrical release. What is it that's driving these young people in their creative?
I think it's mainly that these are people who are doing something that they are passionate about. As an artist, they are pretty much only focused on getting their message out there. They're not beholden to any kind of producer or somebody who's going to come in and say, you have to take this out of the movie because it's not going to make enough money. They're not concerned about budget or, what the screenings are going to give them in terms of money or anything like that. They're just trying to make a movie that's completely about their vision. So they're always very honest. I find a lot of times more honest than big budget pictures that have studios and producers telling them what they can and can't do. These are just kids or young filmmakers or young artists who are completely focused on making what they have in their head a reality, and it's always true to that.
Jonathan, what's in store for the remainder of the month? This first one is 2016, am I correct?
Yeah, so the first week of May, we'll be running the 2016 winners, and those are the 12 films that won first, second, and third place in each of the 4 film categories, which again are narrative, doc, animation, and experimental. So we'll have the winners from 2016 the first week of May. The second week of May, we'll have 2017, third week 2018, and then the last week of May 2019, which was last year's festival. And they will be streaming every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday at noon and 8 p.m. Central Standard Time. And they will be available to view completely free of charge on URBAN-15.org. You just click at the top, it says live stream, and there's a big button that will send you to the live stream, and you'll be able to find it there.
John, we really don't know how long this distance of reality is going to be keeping us apart. So what are the possible solutions for the 2020 Josiah Festival?
So since we're, now living in this reality where we can't really gather together in large groups anymore, we're going to be screening the 2020 festival online And it'll be available like the ones we're going to be screening in the month of May. But we'll be able to have all of the films from each of the screenings, and hopefully we'll be able to provide the workshops remotely to some schools as well, which is something that we're always happy to provide.
Well, thank you, man. You've done a great job putting this festival together, and we'll let people see just the high-end quality that's coming in from these very passionate young filmmakers. Again, I want to remind everybody that this will start tomorrow night, May 5th, at noon and 8 p.m., and it goes through the entire month of May. Okay, thank you, John. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking time from your busy lives to watch Hidden Histories. Very many profound and insightful, inspirational visions were presented to us by our three guests. I thank them on your behalf for their wisdom and their influence on Central Texas. Please, on June 1st, our next Hidden Histories will be part of the Pride Month celebrations in the city of San Antonio. And we will be exploring the various collections of the early LGBT movement that have been amassed at libraries and homes here in our area. So, June 1st, 7 p.m., Hidden Histories. Good night, and be safe, be sane, and be healthy. Thank you.